With you, Mr. President, I want to ensure that France and the whole of Europe works enthusiastically with Canada, the most European of non-European countries.
I think it's a great opportunity for Canada to work with the UK and strengthen our partnership with one of our key allies.
This is Canada positioning itself as a leader of the democratic world, not waiting for American permission, not following American leadership, building its own coalitions.
The Canada-Europe alliance is ripping the rug out from under the United States, leaving decades of assumed power in ruins. U.S. allies are walking away, refusing to follow Washington's lead, and openly building permanent systems that exclude American influence. What was once unshakable, the U.S., as the central pillar of Western security and economic dominance, is now under brutal, irreversible assault.
Canada becoming more close to China is certainly going to have an impact on U.S.-Canada relations. However, President Donald Trump doesn't seem to either understand that or simply doesn't get it.
The United States, long seen as the untouchable backbone of Western power, is suddenly looking shaky. It's the kind of shift that sends shockwaves through history books. On January 8, 2026, French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to French ambassadors with rare bluntness. The U.S. was abandoning its allies and dismantling the international order it had built. A day earlier, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier painted an even darker picture, warning the world was turning into a den of thieves, where the strongest take whatever they want. These were alarms, and they weren't.
New polling shows President Trump underwater on many of the issues which got him elected. An AP poll shows 59% disapprove of his overall job performance, with over 60% disapproval on immigration, the economy, and foreign policy.
The United States and Europe have been economic partners for almost 80 years, weathering the Cold War together, building NATO together, and creating the modern international trading system together. That partnership has been the bedrock of Western prosperity and global order. But now everything is cracking, and it's happening faster than anyone predicted.
Coming from some marginal voices, this was Europe's top leadership, telling the world that the United States could no longer be trusted. Trump's threats to annex Greenland, his public belittling of Canada, his casual talks of invading, it was the final straw. Allies that once deferred automatically to American authority were now deciding they had to act without it. Canada and Europe were no longer willing to wait for Washington to do the right thing. They began building permanent alliances and operational frameworks that sideline the United States. The unshakable leader of the West was suddenly optional.
Canadian exports to Europe were climbing, new buyers were emerging, and the economic pressure from tariffs wasn't materializing because Canada had developed alternatives. So the Trump administration devised what they considered a brilliant strategy: corner Canada by eliminating their options.
The first seismic sign came from Canada's Prime Minister, markcarney. When he was sworn in on March 14, 2025, he broke with a tradition older than most living Canadians. Normally, a Canadian leader's first foreign trip meant a handshake in Washington and a show of loyalty to the United States. Carney went the opposite way. Within days, he was in Paris, calling Canada the most European of non-European countries, and promising to be a strong and reliable partner, but not to Washington.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's first international trip. It's a quick visit, but jam-packed to strengthen Canada's ties with two of its closest allies, France and the United Kingdom. It's heavily symbolic as well, given Canada is embroiled presently in a trade war with the United States, which has historically been the destination of the Prime Minister's first foreign visit.
Of geopolitical and economic crisis, it's more important than ever for that relationship to continue to develop. From here, the Prime Minister will head to London to meet with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and King Charles.
From Paris, he traveled to London for a private audience with King Charles III. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, and he didn't shy away from confronting Trump's rhetoric. Annexation of Canada, he said, was unthinkable and disrespectful, while hints surfaced that F-35 fighter jets from the U.S. might no longer be part of Canada's defense plans. Every move was deliberate, calculated to respond to Trump's threats and public bullying. This was not symbolic, it was strategic.
Today it's China. Tomorrow it will be Qatar. And so clearly what we're seeing now is the Canada is doing all it can under Mark Carney to lessen its dependence on the United States, particularly at a time when those Kuzma negotiations will begin in earnest in the spring, and it's looking more and more likely like President Donald Trump will walk away from that. I think what we're seeing here is Prime Minister Carney is hoping to actually have something in place so that if and when that deal comes to an end, Canada isn't left holding the bag.
Canada is a reliable, trustworthy, and strong partner of France, which shares our values and lives them through action during this age of economic and geopolitical crises.
By June 23, 2025, the pivot became permanent. Canada signed a formal security and defense partnership with the European Union, establishing a framework that covers cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, military procurement, and governance. One of the most powerful tools in this framework is SAFE, the EU's $150 billion joint procurement initiative. It allows Canada to tap into collective European defense supply chains, completely bypassing U.S. contractors. Companies that had long assumed guaranteed access to Canadian defense contracts suddenly found themselves sidelined. Standards, contracts, military planning, all of it would now flow through Europe. This isn't a temporary fix, it's path-dependent. Once defense procurement is routed through Europe, reclaiming U.S. centrality is virtually impossible. Within months, decades of automatic U.S. command in NATO and defense procurement evaporated.
Today, the president threatened to slap new tariffs on countries that don't go along with an American acquisition of the island. If that all sounds familiar to you, it's because he's also warned that countries that do business with Iran would face new levies just a few days ago. So, Molly, the president not committing to not attacking one of our closest allies.
You know, it's not good. It's not good.
Not great.
Not great.
The consequences went far beyond contracts and logistics. They hit at trust and credibility. Macron and Steinmeier didn't deliver these speeches by accident. They were carefully timed, broadcast internationally, and designed to send a clear message. Europe will no longer defer to a partner that acts unpredictably. Canada reinforced it. Greenland, a Danish territory rich in rare earth minerals and strategic Arctic routes, became a flashpoint. Trump openly refused to rule out military force to seize it. In response, 7 NATO allies, including Canada, publicly defended Denmark's sovereignty. Canada even opened a consulate there, not to observe, but to signal solidarity and establish a permanent diplomatic footprint. The message was unmistakable. Bullying doesn't compel compliance, it forces independence.
Look, NATO is one of the sort of most successful treaties of the, this has
history.
Right. I mean, and I think what I think is the most interesting is that you'll remember that in Trump's first term, everyone was trying to keep him from leaving NATO. And it's sort of interesting that he sort of figured out a way to just destroy NATO without leaving NATO, which is to just, I mean, I don't think you could have cooked this up in your worst imagination.
Economic chaos added fuel to the fire. Trump's tariffs rose from 2.3% at the end of 2024 to 17% by November 2025. U.S. businesses froze investment. The dollar fell by over 9%, and unemployment climbed. American firms couldn't plan beyond the next quarter because each day could bring a new tariff. Meanwhile, Canadian and European companies operating in stable regulatory environments quietly captured market share. Investors shifted their money to safer, more predictable markets. These aren't temporary advantages. They are structural shifts in economic power. A decade of change that might have taken years was now happening in months.
So this has been cooked up by a crew of pretty unserious people.
Don't forget the map. Don't forget It's big on a map, which is huge for Trump. If you look at a Mercator map, that Greenland is there and giant. So of course that should belong to the United States.
So it's just like a real estate thing for him.
It really is, and I think that it's one of the many ways where you see Trump have a weird idea and the administration try to reverse engineer a policy out of it.
Right.
Like he wanted Greenland because reasons. They're trying to find what those reasons are.
The broader picture is stark. America's influence relied on trust, consistency, and reliability. Once those were gone, allies didn't just complain, they built alternatives. From defense frameworks to Arctic diplomacy to economic realignment, Canada and Europe were turning the tables. Washington was no longer the automatic center of Western strategy. Its partnerships, once taken for granted, were now optional, and the world is paying attention. Canada didn't stop there. They went a step further and announced a new consulate in Greenland, set to open in February 2026. Symbolically, it was massive. Canada wasn't just watching the situation unfold. They were planting a flag, literally and diplomatically, saying, "We've got Greenland's back, and we're here to stay." The timing couldn't have been clearer. U.S. power without trust equals bullying, and the response from allies was operational, not rhetorical. This was the Arctic teaching a lesson in real-time, sometimes, unpredictability and threats push even the closest partners to build infrastructure that sidelines you. And just like that, the Arctic became a case study in how America's behavior was literally reshaping global alliances.
The plan seemed straightforward. The U.S. would force the European Union to choose sides. Either Europe would halt expanding trade with Canada and join the American pressure campaign, or the U.S. would start treating Europe as an economic adversary. The threat was explicit: cooperate against Canada or face tariffs on European goods entering American markets.
Reaffirming the connection with Canada. Of course, the King is head of state. And in this time where you have President Donald Trump repeating his wishes for Canada to become the 51st state, Canadians overwhelmingly rejecting that. And the King will obviously do whatever Canadians want, what the Prime Minister says goes, essentially. The King will support that.
According to the Tax Policy Center, Trump's tariffs cost the average American household $2,006. Unemployment rose, the dollar plunged more than 9% since January 2025, and businesses froze everything from hiring to investment. Trade War 2.0 had a neat little sevenfold increase in tariffs, from 2.3% to 17%, all in under a year. That's enough to make any CFO break into a cold sweat. CNN polls show 61% of Americans felt economic conditions worsened under Trump. Meanwhile, Canadian and European competitors were sitting back, relaxing, and quietly capturing market share as American companies stumbled under the weight of unpredictability.
It's bizarre, and none of us knows where this goes, and it's, we joke about it, but it's just like, it's absolutely insane, and there's no other word for it, and no matter what resources exist under the soil there.
It's almost ironic. The U.S., so used to leading the world economically, was voluntarily giving up global influence. Every arbitrary tariff, every sudden threat, every bit of political chaos was creating space for others to move in. Investors noticed too. Money started flowing to Canada, Europe, and even Australia, where regulations were boring, predictable, and, shockingly, reliable. U.S. companies were paralyzed by political unpredictability, while foreign firms were seizing opportunities Americans didn't even know existed. The picture was clear. While the U.S. was busy shooting itself in the foot, its allies were quietly consolidating power.
It is a great pleasure, and I think entirely appropriate, that my first official bilateral in Canada with a head of government is with Prime Minister Starmer. Canada and the United Kingdom, of course, share history, we share values, we share governance. We are in a parliament inspired by the Westminster tradition.
Canada and Europe weren't just taking advantage. They were building the rules-based alternative that the world was craving. Canada, geographically next door, offers political stability, a highly skilled workforce, and access to both North American and Commonwealth markets. Europe, meanwhile, has a massive single market, legal predictability, and a moral edge on climate leadership, attracting trillions in investment. Canadian and European companies weren't just surviving. They were operationally capturing U.S. market share, setting up permanent supply chains that bypassed American contractors. SAFE, the European procurement framework, is a perfect example. Once defense and tech procurement are integrated into Europe's collective systems, U.S. companies are no longer central, they're optional. This isn't a temporary response to one administration. these frameworks will persist regardless of who sits in the White House. The structural advantage is permanent. And then there's the public perception. It's one thing to see allies quietly pivot behind closed doors. It's another when trust collapses in plain sight. Polls show 76% of Germans now believe the U.S. is unreliable, with only 15% saying they can trust it. In Canada, 77% oppose the idea of becoming the 51st U.S. state. Macron and Steinmeier's speeches weren't just rhetoric. They were a signal that Europe intends to achieve strategic autonomy, no longer assuming automatic American leadership. NATO allies are recalibrating. They can't rely on the U.S. for military or political support without second-guessing. Across the world, the U.S. is starting to look less like the dominant, trustworthy partner it once was, and more like a bully whose unchecked power is crumbling even as its legitimacy crumbles.
But it does effectively end NATO.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think...
yourself.
Right. I mean, because we would be one of those the country breaking it.
Yeah, well, Macron basically said,
yeah,
you know, that I think it was something like, you know, this is a version of a new colonial era. He didn't name Trump, but it was very clear who he was taking a swipe at earlier.
It's a psychological shock as much as a strategic one. Influence is more than weapons or dollars. It's credibility, and credibility is gone. From Greenland to defense procurement to economic policy, the U.S. is being systematically written out, not by force or threat, but because it made itself unreliable. Allies are not turning away tomorrow. They're building independent systems today. What Trump thought would intimidate partners ended up teaching them exactly what to do. Act without Washington, plan without Washington, and slowly, inexorably, make American centrality optional. The consequences of all this are permanent, and they're already visible. Canada and Europe aren't just testing the waters. They've built frameworks that are locked in. The Security and Defense Partnership, Canada's consulate in Greenland, and the shift of corporate supply chains to European networks aren't temporary experiments. They're institutionalized, irreversible paths. The United States still has power, but the old levers, fear, tradition, automatic compliance, are gone. Allies no longer wait for American approval. They act independently, filling the economic and geopolitical vacuum with Canada, Europe, and other stable powers like Australia. What's staggering is how fast this happened. Trump's chaotic policies accelerated transitions that might have taken a decade, creating permanent declines in U.S. influence across multiple sectors. The shock is real. Allies have operationalized independence. American centrality in global affairs is no longer automatic. This isn't a minor shift. It's a tectonic realignment, a new world order where the U.S. leads only when it earns trust, not by default.